Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. To our members here and to those who are online, as well as our guests. If you're a guest here or online, we're really honored that you've chosen to spend this time with us. We hope it'll be an encouragement to you and an honor to the Lord. It's supposed to be a beautiful day today. I hope that everything that we do here this morning, everything that you get to do with the rest of this day will just remind you of the goodness of God and renew some joy in your life. There are certain life skills that all of us ought to know. How to swim, how to drive, knowing how to cook, that's a good one, right? But some are more critical than others. And I'm sure all of us have heard stories like this one. It was about 4 years ago in 2016 in Chandler, Arizona. There was a boy and his 26-year-old baseball coach. They were outside doing drills. It was just the two of them. And suddenly the coach collapsed. He was having a heart attack. But 13-year-old Nathan Boyer knew what to do, and he rolled his coach over onto his back. He used the coach's phone to call 911, and he immediately began to perform CPR on him. And he kept doing that until the paramedics arrived a few minutes later and took over. But they let Nate know that had he not been there and given his coach the CPR, that he would not have made it. He would not have survived. And so Nathan was a hero. It was good that Nathan didn't think that CPR is just something that, certain other people ought to know, or just adults ought to know, or whatever, that he had taken the trouble to learn it himself. And when it comes to medical intervention, we usually leave it to the professionals, but there are some things that all of us ought to know how to do. As believers in Jesus, there are also certain skills. There are also certain competencies. Sometimes we call them spiritual disciplines that we all ought to know and practice. They are like the barbells or the push-ups that we do for building spiritual strength. Things like prayer or meditation, fasting, stewardship, celebration. Those are not just things, for the Old Testament. They're not just for people who are part of a special order of Christians, the ninja or special forces Christians, but they are for every follower of Jesus. I know that we may tend to think, I don't know about all those things. I'm just here to try to live a good life and go to heaven. And may I respectfully say, no, you are not. No, we are not. You are here, and we are here together, not just for our own sakes, but for the sake of others. And so the Lord has provided and revealed certain practices that will help us. They'll help us to grow in trying to live a good life for ourselves, yes, but also it'll help us to grow in our ability to be helpful to others in their journey, and that's important. One of those spiritual disciplines that seems to be particularly needed in the times that we're passing through right now is the discipline of lament. Now, it's not one that we talk about very much. You probably would have a hard time remembering the last time that you had a discussion about lament. Maybe because it is or can be a heavy subject. I don't think it's meant to be. I think the Lord actually blesses us with this in order to make our burden lighter. We'll talk about that in a minute. But maybe we don't talk about it very much because it doesn't seem very exciting. I appreciate John's words, but I wonder really if everybody was excited when you heard about okay, we'll get to talk about lament today, right? Or maybe it's just because we haven't understood it very well. But I want to invite all of us to open our hearts for a few moments and be willing to reflect on it this morning. Lament is not just an Old Testament idea. It's not just for funerals or for those who have just lost a loved one. According to the dictionary, it means to express sorrow or grief. But according to the Bible, that is from a biblical standpoint, it means to pour out your grief toward the Lord and with the Lord. It is a God-given means for us to deal with our stress and our anxiety and loss in a way that doesn't alienate us from God, but instead it actually connects us to God. It is a practice that can be relevant for us at any time, but again, perhaps maybe even more so for us this year when we are living with so many stressful experiences. Due to the pandemic, our work lives, our school lives, our family lives, how we shop, how we communicate, all of those things have been impacted. It's been going on long enough now that there is beginning to be a growing sense of loss about the life that we all knew. Along with that has been the loss of life in some of our communities, not just from the pandemic, but also from the social upheaval that has come over this summer. We very rightly feel the pain and grief when people are clashing and some are even dying, no matter what they did, what those people did, or why they did it. It grieves us that there are still too many cases where we have not learned how to love each other more and to treat each other better. It is very important that we know how to process or deal with the sorrows that come into our lives. We can have good grief or we can have bad grief. In fact, one title that I thought about giving to the lesson was Good Grief. But I had second thoughts about it. But there is the kind that is destructive and that fuels bitterness and anger and brokenness. And there is the kind of grief which can actually lead to healing. And someone could argue that our culture lacks a really good way of expressing grief. One popular approach is to remain stoic and just put on a brave face and wait things out. By contrast, when you read in Scripture, the Hebrew culture had no problem with lamenting and publicly expressing grief. And I don't mean over trivial things like the proverbial spilt milk, right? But over things like deep sorrow, over sin, over injustice, over loss. And that's why Ecclesiastes 3 says that there is a time to weep and there's a time to laugh. There's a time to mourn and there's a time to dance. This is, I think, very enlightening. When it was time to celebrate, they celebrated. They laughed, they danced. That's one of the reasons why our study of heaven and the afterlife is so exciting to me. The picture that the Bible paints is not one of a sort of a tepid get-together, where there are cups of punch and, we're eating little chalky mints and making small talk. It's the story of a wedding where there is joy and there is feasting and there is exuberant celebration. But by the same token, when it was time to mourn or to lament, It was something that engaged you body and soul. There was physical acts that were a part of that. They publicly declared that you had entered a time of grieving. For instance, when you read about in Scripture about people tearing their clothes or throwing ashes or dust up in the air or on themselves, these were expressions that were recognized as sadness and grief. When Jacob thought his son Joseph had been killed by wild animals, Scripture says in Genesis that he tore his clothing. Sort of like the way in our culture a bereaved person will wear black clothing, or others might wear an armband or something like that to show that we're commiserating with the family. But all ancient cultures would have some way of expressing this. There was a difference, though, when it came to the Jewish people. And it carried over into the church as other cultures then flowed into the church. Sorrow and loss, grief and suffering were not something that was meant to make us feel cut off from God, at least not ultimately. It was actually meant to bring us nearer to God. That's God's desire in those times. God's presence is the place where we are meant to carry our disgrace. Lament is how the saints shared their complaints. It's where we are to go with our woes. It's how we should be dealing with our crushed feelings in order to find healing. And if approaching the Lord in this way seems somehow irreverent or dishonoring to you, I assure you that it is not. The Bible is full of examples of it. The bulk of the book of Job is Job's complaint to God that he has not been treated justly by the Lord and by his friends. When Jonah preached to the Ninevites, you remember his message, very, very pithy, very to the point, 40 more days and the city is going to be overthrown. He didn't say anything about fasting, but that's what they did. The king declared a fast. They put on sackcloth, and they sat down in the dust, and they put sackcloth in their animals. Well, why do all of this? Well, it was a recognized sign of their remorse and of their mourning before the Lord. And Scripture says about those Ninevites that they called on the Lord. The entire book of Lamentations is the account of the prophet Jeremiah and his wailing and despair over the destruction of Jerusalem and the people's suffering and their humiliation. Jeremiah was something of an expert when it comes to lament. Those who knew the heart of God did not turn from him when they had done wrong or when they felt someone had wronged them. Even if they believed, as sometimes they did, that it was God himself who had done them wrong. We know that Job felt that way. Some of the Psalms suggest this. But because they knew that in the end, justice and comfort and hope and healing could come from nowhere else. So this is the place where we need to turn first with our grief, with our anxiety. I'd like us to read a couple of verses from Psalm 126 together. It says, "Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy. Those who go out weeping, carrying seed to sow, will return with songs of joy, carrying sheaves with them." Now, this is where we get the lyrics from the song. It may have come to mind for you just then, "Bringing in the Sheaves." Anyone remember that song? I remember as a child wondering what in the world is a sheave, and why are we carrying them? But this is a very interesting metaphor, actually, where our sorrows are imagined, not just as pain that we have to endure, but as seed that when it is properly sown will produce a harvest of joy. That's the image here. When you think about it, the psalmist here is implying, number one, that it is possible to waste your sorrows. Think about the image here. A farmer goes out with a sack of seed, and we expect, that he will carefully and skillfully disperse this seed, and in time, crops will come up. He'll be able to feed his family with them. But what if he didn't do it like that? What if he went out with that whole sack of seed and just dumped it in one place? Well, it would have been a mess, right? I mean, maybe you would get a little bit of growth out of that, or maybe none at all. But the point is that it would be a terrible waste. And in the same way, it is possible to grieve in our lives in such a way that it doesn't produce any good at all. We can do a dump, if you will, of our pain and disappointment so that all we do is vent and lash out in frustration, but it doesn't help us. And it doesn't change the situation. There's no fruit, in other words, that comes from it. But secondly, the psalm here implies that joy can actually be produced by sorrow. Now, all of us, I think, believe that joy can follow sorrow. We've seen that happen in our lives, and we get comfort from that. There's another psalm, Psalm 30, verse 5, which says, "Weeping may stay for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning." And so we understand that joy can come after sorrow. But Psalm 126 is saying more than that. It's saying that the seeds of sadness actually play a part in producing joy. You can be a happier, more peaceful person in the long run because of it, if you sorrow in the proper way. Now, I know that this idea is not always easy to accept. I may not have convinced you yet. I mean, we wonder, how can that possibly be? But think about it. For those of us who already have a relationship with Jesus, we know that this is true. We've seen it. For one reason, we know that Jesus himself brought joy out of sorrow. He endured all kinds of real anguish in his life, and not just the physical kind, although that was significant, and not just during the last week of his life, but throughout it. There was the rejection and the scorn and the humiliation that he faced throughout his life. Hebrews 12:2 tells us that because of the joy awaiting him, Jesus endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and now he is seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. What Jesus did was the ultimate example of bringing joy out of sorrow. For Jesus, there was no way to avoid it. There was no way to go around it. There was only to go through it. And that's what he did. And his agony resulted in his joy. And it resulted in our joy. We all will have our crosses to endure. We'll have our burdens to carry and our griefs to bear. What we don't want to do is waste it. To waste it being hateful or vindictive or bitter. Instead, we should gather it all up and entrust it to the Lord, who can make something good come out of it. When we imitate how Jesus dealt with the miseries of this life, it will empower us to sorrow in a far better way. And just quickly, how does that work? Well, for one thing, it frees us from suffering that comes from guilt. We won't have to sit and wonder, why is everything going bad in my life? What have I done? What's gone wrong here? Is God somehow punishing me for something? But I can know immediately, no, Jesus has already taken my punishment. So that can't be it. Number two, it frees us from suffering and self-pity and anger. I won't shake my fist at heaven and say, why is God doing this to me? Why is God letting this happen? Instead, I'll say, wait, Jesus has suffered more than I ever will so that I can be with him and him with me. I don't have to get mired in the swamp of self-pity and anger. I can trust Jesus and his heart and his intentions for me. Number three, when I see the model of how Jesus dealt with his grief, it gives me perspective so that I can live in patience. You remember when the Lord shared with the disciples about his sufferings that were soon to come. And even when they witnessed it with their own eyes, they could still understand no good coming from it. They didn't see how it could bring about good. But afterwards, they did understand how his sufferings meant their joy. And that is what enabled them to suffer for Jesus' sake as well. In fact, tradition tells us that all of the apostles, except for one, died a martyr's death, and they were willing to do that because of the example of Jesus. And fourth, Jesus' example of how he dealt with grief helps us because it frees us to entrust all of our pain to God. Remember that it was Jesus who prayed to his Father, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now that is a classic prayer of lament that Jesus has engaged there. Hebrews 5:7 tells us that during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Jesus practiced lament. All of this is to say that there is still a vital place in our lives today for the disciples of Jesus to lament. James 4, verse 8, James admonishes the early church in this way: "Come near to God, and he will come near to you." This is what John read for us a moment ago. "Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, and wail. Change your laughter to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up." And I remember reading through James in the past and thinking, James must be really upset with these people. He must really have a bone to pick with them. Why is he speaking to them in this way? And now I read it and realize James is saying that there is still a place for us to lament. There are things that can and should cause us to grieve. Not that we go around necessarily, in dark clothes or with dirt on our heads or something like that. In fact, there's a place where the Lord instructs his people through Jeremiah. He says, "Tell my people that they should rend their hearts and not their garments." In other words, you should be torn in heart, brokenhearted about injustice, brokenhearted about sin, brokenhearted about breaking faith with me, and not just make an outward show about it. That's not the point. But if we claim to serve the Lord, yet we're double-minded, if we still want to please the world, James is saying, well, that's reason to mourn. If there's division in our homes, if there is hatred in our communities, if there is strife in the church, then that is reason to lament. And that is reason to bring that before the Lord in order for him to bring good out of it. I think it's important for us to realize that there's no glory in us being indifferent about the things which grieve the heart of God. In fact, there's a quote, and I don't know who said it, but someone who said, "Lord, break my heart with the things which break yours." And there are things that are going on in our world, and there are always things going on in our lives which bring us pain. And I think the reminder is here that God has given us a place to bring those things. That is the proper first step. Now, there's going to be things that we need to do beyond that to bring healing in our lives, healing in our relationships, healing in our communities. But that is the right first place to bring it. And so I just want to conclude with a final word from Peter, 1 Peter chapter 5, where Peter exhorts us, and I want to encourage you this morning. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. Let's hear that last part again. Cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. Lord bless you.